Section 8 of Curiosities of Literature, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording, or LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Curiosities of Literature, Volume 1 by Isaac Disraeli, Recovery of Manuscripts. Our ancient classics had a very narrow escape from total annihilation. Many have perished, many are but fragments, and chance, blind arbiter of the works of genius, has left us some not of the highest value, which, however, have proved very useful as a test, to show the pedantry of those who adore antiquity not from true feeling, but from traditional prejudice. We lost a great number of ancient authors by the conquest of Egypt by the Saracens, which deprived Europe of the use of the papyrus. They could find no substitute, and knew no other expedient but writing on parchment, which became every day more scarce and costly. Ignorance and barbarism unfortunately seized on Roman manuscripts, and industriously defaced pages once imagined to have been immortal. The most elegant compositions of classic Rome were converted into the psalms of a breviary or the prayers of a missal. Livy and Tacitus "hide their diminished heads" to preserve the legend of a saint, and immortal truths were converted into clumsy fictions. It happened that the most voluminous authors were the greatest sufferers. These were preferred because their volume, being the greatest, most profitably repaid their destroying industry, and furnished ampler scope for future transcription. A Livy or a Diodorus was preferred to the smaller works of Cicero or Horace, and it is to this circumstance that Juvenal, Persius, and Martial have come down to us entire, rather probably than to these pious personages preferring their obscenities, as some have accused them. At Rome, a part of a book of Livy was found between the lines of a parchment but half effaced, on which they had substituted a book of the Bible, and a recent discovery of Cicero de Republica, which lay concealed under some monkish writing, shows the fate of ancient manuscripts. This important political treatise was discovered in the year 1823 by Angelo Mai in the library of the Vatican. A treatise on the Psalms covered it. This second treatise was written in the clear, minute character of the Middle Ages, but beneath it Mai saw distinct traces of the larger letters of the work of Cicero, and, to the infinite joy of the learned, succeeded in restoring to the world one of the most important works of the great orator. That the monks had not in high veneration the profane authors appears by a facetious anecdote. To read the classics was considered as a very idle recreation, and some held them in great horror. To distinguish them from other books, they invented a disgraceful sign. When a monk asked for a pagan author, after making the general sign they used in their manual and silent language when they wanted a book, he added a particular one, which consisted in scratching under his ear, as a dog which feels an itching scratches himself in that place with his paw. Because, said they, an unbeliever is compared to a dog. In this manner they expressed an itching for those dogs, Virgil or Horace. Many bishops and abbots began to consider learning as pernicious to true piety, and confounded illiberal ignorance with Christian simplicity, says Vaurien. The study of pagan authors was declared to inculcate paganism. The same sort of reasoning led others to say that reading of the Scriptures would infallibly change the readers to Jews. It is amusing to look back on these vain efforts to stop the effect of the printing press. There have been ages when, for the possession of a manuscript, some would transfer an estate, or leave in pawn for its loan hundreds of golden crowns, and when even the sale or loan of a manuscript was considered of such importance as to have been solemnly registered by public acts. Absolute as was Louis XI., he could not obtain the manuscript of Rhasis, an Arabian writer, from the library of the Faculty of Paris to have a copy made, without pledging 100 golden crowns, and the president of his treasury, charged with this commission, sold part of his plate to make the deposit. For the loan of a volume of Avicenna, a baron offered a pledge of 10 marks of silver, which was refused, because it was not considered equal to the risk incurred of losing a volume of Avicenna. These events occurred in 1471. One cannot but smile at an anterior period, when a Countess of Anjou bought a favourite book of homilies for 200 sheep, some skins of martens, and bushels of wheat and rye. In those times, manuscripts were important articles of commerce. They were excessively scarce and preserved with the utmost care. Usurers themselves considered them as precious objects for pawn. A student of Pavia, who was reduced, raised a new fortune by leaving in pawn a manuscript of a body of law, and a grammarian, who was ruined by a fire, rebuilt his house with 2 small volumes of Cicero. At the restoration of letters, the researches of literary men were chiefly directed to this point. Every part of Europe and Greece was ransacked, and the glorious end considered, there was something sublime in this humble industry, which often recovered a lost author of antiquity and gave one more classic to the world. This occupation was carried on with enthusiasm, and a kind of mania possessed many, who exhausted their fortunes in distant voyages and profuse prices. In reading the correspondence of the learned Italians of these times, their adventures of manuscript hunting are very amusing, and their raptures, their congratulations, or at times their condolences, and even their censures, are all immoderate. The acquisition of a province would not have given so much satisfaction as the discovery of an author little known, or not known at all. O great gain! O unexpected felicity! I entreat you, my Poggio, send me the manuscript as soon as possible, that I may see it before I die, exclaims Aretino in a letter overflowing with enthusiasm on Poggio's discovery of a copy of Quintilian. Some of the half-witted who joined in this great hunt were often thrown out, and some paid high for manuscripts not authentic. The knave played on the bungling amateur of manuscripts, whose credulity exceeded his purse. But even among the learned much ill blood was inflamed. He who had been most successful in acquiring manuscripts was envied by the less fortunate, and the glory of possessing a manuscript of Cicero seemed to approximate to that of being its author. It is curious to observe that in these vast importations into Italy of manuscripts from Asia, John Arispa, who brought many hundreds of Greek manuscripts, laments that he had chosen more profane than sacred writers, which circumstance, he tells us, was owing to the Greeks, who would not so easily part with theological works, but did not highly value profane writers. These manuscripts were discovered in the obscurest recesses of monasteries. They were not always imprisoned in libraries, but rotting in dark, unfrequented corners with rubbish. It required not less ingenuity to find out places where to grope in than to understand the value of the acquisition. An universal ignorance then prevailed in the knowledge of ancient writers. A scholar of those times gave the first rank among the Latin writers to one Valerius. Whether he meant Martial or Maximus is uncertain. He placed Plato and Tully among the poets, and imagined that Ennius and Statius were contemporaries. A library of 600 volumes was then considered as an extraordinary collection. Among those whose lives were devoted to this purpose, Poggio the Florentine stands distinguished, but he complains that his zeal was not assisted by the great. He found under a heap of rubbish in a decayed coffer in a tower belonging to the monastery of San Gallo the work of Quintilian. He is indignant at its forlorn situation. At least, he cries, it should have been preserved in the library of the monks, but I found it in teterrimo quondam et obscuro carcere, and to his great joy drew it out of its grave. The monks have been complimented as the preservers of literature, but by facts like the present their real affection may be doubted. The most valuable copy of Tacitus, of whom so much is wanting, was likewise discovered in a monastery of Westphalia. It is a curious circumstance in literary history that we should owe Tacitus to this single copy, for the Roman emperor of that name had copies of the works of his illustrious ancestor placed in all the libraries of the empire, and every year had 10 copies transcribed. But the Roman libraries seem to have been all destroyed, and the imperial protection availed nothing against the teeth of time. The original manuscript of Justinian's Pandects was discovered by the Pisans when they took a city in Calabria. That vast code of laws had been in a manner unknown from the time of that emperor. This curious book was brought to Pisa, and when Pisa was taken by the Florentines, was transferred to Florence, where it is still preserved. It sometimes happened that manuscripts were discovered in the last agonies of existence. Papirius Masson found in the house of a bookbinder of Lyons the works of Abegard. The mechanic was on the point of using the manuscripts to line the covers of his books. Footnote: Agobard was Archbishop of Lyons and one of the most learned men of the 9th century. He was born in 1779, raised to the prelacy in 1816, from which he was expelled by Louis le Débonnaire for espousing the cause of his son Lothaire. He fled to Italy, but was restored to his see in 838, dying in 840, when the Church canonized him. He was a strenuous churchman, but with enlightened views, and his style as an author is remarkable alike for its clearness and perfect simplicity. His works were unknown until discovered in the manner narrated above, and were published by the discoverer at Paris in 1603, the originals being bequeathed to the Royal Library at his death. On examination, several errors were found in this edition, and a new one was published in 1662, to which another treatise by Agobard was added. End of footnote. A page of the 2nd decade of Livy, it is said, was found by a man of letters in the parchment of his battledore while he was amusing himself in the country. He hastened to the maker of the battledore, but arrived too late. The man had finished the last page of Livy about a week before. Many works have undoubtedly perished in this manuscript state. By a petition of Dr. Dee to Queen Mary in the Cotton Library, it appears that Cicero's treatise De Republica was once extant in this country. Uwe observes that Petronius was probably entire in the days of John of Salisbury, who quotes fragments not now to be found in the remains of the Roman bard. Raimond Soranzo, a lawyer in the papal court, possessed 2 books of Cicero on glory, which he presented to Petrarch, who lent them to a poor aged man of letters, formerly his preceptor. Urged by extreme want, the old man pawned them, and returning home, died suddenly without having revealed where he had left them. They have never been recovered. Petrarch speaks of them with ecstasy, and tells us that he had studied them perpetually. 2 centuries afterwards, this treatise on glory by Cicero was mentioned in a catalogue of books bequeathed to a monastery of nuns, but when inquired after, was missing. It is supposed that Petrus Alcinous, physician to that household, purloined it, and after transcribing as much of it as he could into his own writings, had destroyed the original. Alcinous, in his book De Exilio, the critics observed, had many splendid passages which stood isolated in his work, and were quite above his genius. The beggar, or in this case the thief, was detected by mending his rags with patches of purple and gold. In this age of manuscript, there is reason to believe that when a man of letters accidentally obtained an unknown work, he did not make the fairest use of it, but cautiously concealed it from his contemporaries. Leonard Aretino, a distinguished scholar at the dawn of modern literature, having found a Greek manuscript of Procopius de Bello Gothico, translated it into Latin and published the work, but concealing the author's name, it passed as his own, till another manuscript of the same work being dug out of its grave, the fraud of Aretino was apparent. Barbosa, a bishop of Ugento, in 1649, has printed among his works a treatise obtained by one of his domestics, bringing in a fish rolled in a leaf of written paper, which his curiosity led him to examine. He was sufficiently interested to run out and search the fish market till he found the manuscript out of which it had been torn. He published it under the title De Officio Episcopi. Machiavelli acted more adroitly in a similar case. A manuscript of the Apothegms of the Ancients by Plutarch having fallen into his hands, he selected those which pleased him, and put them into the mouth of his hero, Castruccio Castricani. In more recent times we might collect many curious anecdotes concerning manuscripts. Sir Robert Cotton, one day at his tailor's, discovered that the man was holding in his hand, ready to cut up for measures, an original Magna Charta, with all its appendages of seals and signatures. This anecdote is told by Colomies, who long resided in this country, and an original Magna Charta is preserved in the Cottonian Library, exhibiting marks of dilapidation. Cardinal Granvelle, footnote, the celebrated minister of Philip II, end of footnote, left behind him several chests filled with a prodigious quantity of letters, written in different languages, commented, noted, and underlined by his own hand. These curious manuscripts, after his death, were left in a garret to the mercy of the rain and the rats. 5 or 6 of these chests the steward sold to the grocers. It was then that a discovery was made of this treasure. Several learned men occupied themselves in collecting sufficient of these literary relics to form 80 thick folios, consisting of original letters by all the crowned heads in Europe, with instructions for ambassadors and other state papers. A valuable secret history by Sir George Mackenzie, the King's advocate in Scotland, was rescued from a mass of waste paper sold to a grocer, who had the good sense to discriminate it, and communicated this curious memorial to Dr. Macri. The original, in the handwriting of its author, has been deposited in the Advocate's Library. There is an hiatus which contained the history of 6 years. This work excited inquiry after the rest of the manuscripts, which were found to be nothing more than the sweepings of an attorney's office. Montaigne's Journal of his Travels into Italy has been but recently published. A prebendary of Perigord, travelling through this province to make researches relative to its history, arrived at the ancient chateau of Montaigne, in possession of a descendant of this great man. He inquired for the archives, if there had been any. He was shown an old worm-eaten coffer, which had long held papers untouched by the incurious generations of Montaigne. Stifled in clouds of dust, he drew out the original manuscript of the Travels of Montaigne. 2/3 of the work are in the handwriting of Montaigne, and the rest is written by a servant, who always speaks of his master in the third person. But he must have written what Montaigne dictated, as the expressions and the egotisms are all Montaigne's. The bad writing and orthography made it almost unintelligible. They confirmed Montaigne's own observation, that he was very negligent in the correction of his works. Our ancestors were great hiders of manuscripts. Dr. Dee's singular manuscripts were found in the secret drawer of a chest which had passed through many hands undiscovered, and that vast collection of state papers of Thurloe's, the secretary of Cromwell, which formed about 70 volumes in the original manuscripts, accidentally fell out of the false ceiling of some chambers in Lincoln's Inn. A considerable portion of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's letters I discovered in the hands of an attorney. Family papers are often consigned to offices of lawyers, where many valuable manuscripts are buried. Posthumous publications of this kind are too frequently made from sordid motives. Discernment and taste would only be detrimental to the views of bulky publishers. Footnote: one of the most curious modern discoveries was that of the Fairfax papers and correspondence, by the late J. N. Hughes of Winchester, who purchased at a sale at Leeds Castle, Kent, a box apparently filled with old coloured paving tiles. On removing the upper layers, he found a large mass of manuscripts of the time of the civil wars, evidently thus packed for concealment. They have since been published, and add most valuable information to this interesting period of English history. End of section 8.